driven from the Oval Office in absolute disgrace, branded a criminal by the very nation he led. Yet 2 decades later, the world gathered to bury him with a historic state funeral. This paradox masks the terrifying reality of the final breakdown of Richard Nixon. In August 1974, he wandered the White House at night arguing with oil portraits of dead presidents. He was a drunk with the power to end Earth. His condition became so volatile that Henry Kissinger secretly stripped him of his nuclear launch codes. What exactly happens inside the machinery of absolute power when the individual at the center completely disintegrates? The foundation of this collapse was poured decades earlier in the dusty, unforgiving soil of Yorba Linda, California. He was born into a struggling Quaker family where grief and financial ruin were constant companions. 2 of his brothers died of tuberculosis. His father's lemon grove failed completely, forcing the family to run a modest grocery store where a young Richard worked relentlessly, fighting a daily battle against poverty. He possessed a ferocious, grinding intellect, yet he was suffocated by a profound sense of inadequacy. He looked at the Ivy League elite, the wealthy sons of the Eastern establishment, and felt a burning, lifelong resentment. He was the outsider looking in, convinced that the system was rigged against him, and that survival required a ruthless, uncompromising struggle. Every political move he ever made stemmed from this single fatal weakness, a desperate, unquenchable need to prove his superiority and crush those he believed looked down upon him. He built his early career on prosecuting these perceived elites. During his time on the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 1940s, he relentlessly pursued Alger Hiss, a suave, Harvard-educated State Department official accused of espionage. Taking down Hiss was class warfare, a way to prove the privileged establishment was fundamentally corrupt. The strategy worked brilliantly, catapulting him to national prominence in the vice presidency under Dwight Eisenhower at just 39 years old. He was a master of political combat, utilizing television in its infancy to save his career with the famous Checkers speech, directly manipulating public emotion to force the Republican establishment to keep him on the ticket. He proved he could survive immense pressure by bypassing the elites and appealing directly to the grievances of the working class. This psychological wound, however, was ripped wide open in the presidential election of 1960. He faced John F. Kennedy, the exact embodiment of everything he despised. Kennedy was wealthy, charismatic, a product of Harvard, effortlessly gliding through the political spheres that the vice president had to claw his way into. The defeat was agonizingly close, lost by fractions of a percent. For a man whose entire identity was built on outworking his rivals, this loss was intensely personal and deeply humiliating. He genuinely believed the election had been stolen by political machines in Illinois and Texas. The trauma of 1960 cemented a dark conviction in his mind. Playing by the rules resulted in defeat. His political survival instinct morphed into a demand for total, unquestioned control. Enemies were everywhere. The press, the establishment, the Democrats, they were all part of a coordinated conspiracy to destroy him. This constant state of siege required a coping mechanism. The pressure of political life and the weight of his own paranoia began to take a physical toll. The manifestation of this stress was subtle at first. During the grueling campaigns and the bitter wilderness years of the early 1960s, a bottle of scotch became a quiet companion. It was initially a tool to take the edge off, a way to quiet the relentless, calculating machinery of his mind. after long days of political combat. The alcohol masked the anxiety and fueled the late-night strategy sessions, where he plotted his revenge against a system that had rejected him. He built a formidable ironclad public persona, the statesman, the law and order candidate, while privately insulating himself from perceived betrayals. He trusted almost no one, isolating himself with a tiny circle of fiercely loyal aides. He would eventually orchestrate one of the most remarkable resurrections in Democratic history, clawing his way into the Oval Office in 1968. He finally possessed the ultimate prize. The outsider had conquered the establishment, and that very habit, the deep-seated paranoia, the absolute inability to trust, the reliance on dark, isolated brooding, would come back to ruin him later. The presidency does not cure psychological insecurity. It magnifies it. The absolute authority of the White House would soon meet the absolute fragility of his ego. And that collision would birth a foreign policy strategy so dangerous, the world is still unpacking its consequences today. Entering the Oval Office in January 1969, the public saw a resurrected statesman, projecting calm authority and promising to heal a fractured nation. The reality behind the heavy oak doors was entirely different. He immediately constructed an invisible fortress. He ordered the installation of a secret taping system, not for historical preservation, but as an ultimate insurance policy against the subordinates he inherently distrusted. He centralized all foreign policy power within the White House. He bypassed the State Department entirely, relying almost exclusively on his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. This was the architecture of his isolation. By deliberately cutting off the stabilizing influence of career diplomats and military advisors, he designed a system where he alone controlled the levers of global destruction. Together, they weaponized this control through a doctrine of calculated instability, the madman theory. He called it the madman theory. The blueprint for this psychological warfare was explicitly laid out during an evening walk on a foggy beach in California with his closest aide, Bob Haldeman. He instructed Haldeman to leak a specific narrative to the North Vietnamese and the Soviets. The message was simple. The President of the United States is obsessed with communism. He is highly volatile, and he has his hand on the nuclear button. If you push him too far, he cannot be restrained. He wanted the leaders in Moscow and Hanoi to believe they were dealing with a leader completely unmoored from rational geopolitical calculation. This was a breathtakingly dangerous gamble. He was projecting his own deep-seated psychological instability outward, using his genuine capacity for resentment and rage as a diplomatic tool. He believed that if he acted like a madman, the world would bow to his unpredictability out of sheer terror. The physical manifestation of this theory occurred in October 1969, during an operation codenamed Giant Lance. This was not a subtle diplomatic bluff. It was a terrifying escalation that brought the world to the edge of the abyss. He ordered the Strategic Air Command to launch a squadron of 18 B-52 bombers, fully loaded with thermonuclear weapons. These massive aircraft were sent racing toward the eastern border of the Soviet Union. They flew in radio silence over the freezing expanse of the polar ice cap, probing Soviet radar defenses, deliberately triggering early warning systems in Moscow. For 3 straight days, these airborne leviathans circled the Arctic, waiting for an execution order that the pilots believed was imminent. Soviet intelligence watched this maneuver in absolute panic. They could not determine if this was a training exercise, a diplomatic threat, or the opening sequence of World War III. He pushed the global security apparatus to its breaking point simply to prove he was capable of an irrational strike. It was a grotesque display of power, a drama-filled contradiction where the commander of the free world actively cultivated the image of a suicidal fanatic. Many historians argue that this reckless escalation completely failed to intimidate Hanoi into submission, but it succeeded in terrifying America's own allies. The reverberations of this manufactured madness were felt most acutely on the Korean Peninsula. In April 1969, just months into his presidency, the strategy faced a devastating real-world test. A United States Navy EC-121 Warning Star aircraft conducting a routine reconnaissance mission over the Sea of Japan was shot down by North Korean MiG fighters. All 31 American crew members on board were killed. It was a brazen act of aggression, an unprovoked slaughter that demanded an immediate and decisive response. This was the exact scenario the madman theory was supposedly designed to handle. Yet, when confronted with an actual crisis, the facade of the terrifying, unpredictable strongman completely shattered. Behind closed doors, the White House was paralyzed by internal chaos. He exploded into fits of drunken rage. Some historical accounts suggest a heavily intoxicated president demanded an immediate, devastating retaliation against North Korean bases. He wanted to unleash the very apocalypse he had been threatening. But Henry Kissinger and the military brass quietly delayed the execution of these furious, alcohol-fueled orders, waiting for him to sober up. When the morning came, the madman vanished. The fiery threats evaporated into fearful hesitation. He ultimately did nothing. No military retaliation was ordered. He simply resumed the reconnaissance flights with fighter escorts. This paralyzing contradiction sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the South Korean government. In Seoul, President Park Chung-hee and his intelligence apparatus watched the EC-121 crisis unfold with mounting dread. From the South Korean perspective, the United States was demonstrating a fatal combination of erratic hostility and complete operational impotence. The superpower they relied upon for survival was led by a man who threatened nuclear annihilation one day and retreated from a direct attack on American troops the next. This erratic behavior deeply fractured the trust between Washington and Seoul. The South Korean leadership realized that the man in the Oval Office was not a strategic mastermind playing a complex game of three-dimensional chess. He was a deeply unstable individual whose volatile emotional state dictated the security of the entire Pacific Rim. This realization forced South Korea to secretly accelerate its own defense programs, terrified that the American nuclear umbrella was held by a man who might either detonate it on a whim or drop it entirely when threatened. The cost of this psychological gamble was immense. By pretending to be a madman, he eroded the foundational credibility of the American presidency. He believed he was manipulating the world, but the world was simply watching a man slowly losing control of his own fabricated narrative. The Soviet Union did not surrender. They accelerated their own nuclear buildup, preparing for the possibility that the American president might actually follow through on his deranged threats. The burden of maintaining this terrifying facade, combined with the crushing pressure of an unwinnable war in Vietnam, accelerated his reliance on the Scotch bottle in his desk drawer. The alcohol was no longer a tool to take the edge off a long day. It became the fuel necessary to sustain the suffocating weight of his own paranoia. He was trapped in a fortress of his own making, isolated from dissenting voices, surrounded only by men willing to execute his darkest impulses. The executive branch was transformed from an institution of governance into a machine of personal retaliation. He ordered illegal wiretaps on journalists and his own staff members, desperately hunting for leaks that he believed were designed to humiliate him. He compiled an enemies list, mobilizing the Internal Revenue Service and federal agencies to harass and destroy anyone who dared to criticize his administration. The power of the state was weaponized to soothe the bruised ego of a man who could not tolerate opposition. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, convinced that the same elite establishment that mocked him decades ago was still actively plotting his downfall. Up to this point, the madness was directed outward, a weapon pointed at Moscow, Pyongyang, and the press corps. The damage, while severe, was still contained within the boundaries of ruthless executive action. But the hunger for absolute control demands constant feeding. In the spring of 1972, the weapon turned violently inward, aimed directly at the heart of the American democratic process. The paranoia that had driven B-52s to the edge of Soviet airspace was about to break into a quiet office building in Washington, dragging the entire presidency into a terminal crisis. June 17, 1972. A security guard named Frank Wills conducts his midnight rounds at the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. He notices a piece of tape covering the latch of a basement door, preventing it from locking. He removes it. An hour later, he returns and the tape has been replaced. He calls the police. What the responding officers find inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee is not a standard burglary. They arrest 5 men wearing business suits and surgical gloves. These men are carrying sophisticated wiretapping equipment, tear gas pens, cameras, and thousands of dollars in sequentially numbered $100 bills. These are not common thieves. They are a mix of Cuban exiles and former CIA operatives. One of them, James McCord, is the security director for the Committee for the Re-election of the President. The weapon of paranoia had officially misfired, and the debris landed directly on the Oval Office desk. The president was relaxing at his compound in Key Biscayne, Florida, when he first read about the arrests in the morning paper. His initial public posture was sheer dismissiveness, labeling it a third-rate burglary attempt. But beneath the surface, the psychological machinery of absolute terror immediately engaged. He knew exactly who these men were, and that they were managed by his closest political operatives. He had a choice in that opening window of crisis. He could have ruthlessly fired the operatives, blamed overzealous subordinates, and insulated the presidency. He could have survived. But his fatal weakness, that deep-seated terror of humiliation and loss of control, made that impossible. He could not afford to let his enemies score a victory. He perceived the arrest not merely as a legal problem, but as an existential threat to his political survival. He chose to build a fortress of lies. 6 days later, on June 23, 1972, the psychological flaw manifested into a catastrophic executive action. Inside the Oval Office, sitting across from his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, he orchestrated the cover-up. Instead of seeking legal counsel, he demanded a weapon. He instructed Haldeman to summon the director of the CIA and force him to tell the FBI to halt their investigation into the Watergate burglars, falsely citing national security concerns. This was the precise moment the President of the United States crossed the line from a paranoid politician into the architect of a criminal conspiracy. He weaponized the Central Intelligence apparatus to protect his own re-election campaign. And the profound drama-filled contradiction of this moment is that the entire conversation was captured on the voice-activated taping system that he had secretly installed to protect himself. The ultimate instrument of his paranoia was quietly recording the exact audio evidence that would eventually destroy him. The strategy of containment seemed to work flawlessly for a brief, deceptive period. In November 1972, he won one of the most staggering political victories in American history. He secured 49 out of 50 states, entirely crushing his Democratic opponent, George McGovern. He possessed a historic mandate. He had achieved the ultimate validation he had craved since his poverty-stricken childhood in California. The nation had overwhelmingly chosen him. Yet the gap between the public triumph and his inner reality was staggering. Inside the White House, the atmosphere was completely toxic. He did not celebrate the victory. He immediately demanded the resignations of his entire cabinet so he could exact revenge on anyone who had shown insufficient loyalty during his first term. The landslide did not cure his insecurity. It only amplified his vindictiveness. He was the most powerful and popular man in the world. Yet, he felt entirely surrounded by enemies. By the spring of 1973, the fortress began to crack. The Watergate burglars were facing massive prison sentences, and they began demanding hundreds of thousands of dollars in hush money to buy their silence. The White House was essentially functioning as a mafia syndicate, arranging clandestine drops of cash in phone booths and airport lockers to keep their own operatives quiet. The absurdity of the situation was matched only by its desperation. In March, White House counsel John Dean walked into the Oval Office and delivered a fatal, chilling diagnosis. He told the president directly that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the hush money payments were not stopped, it would kill the administration. As the Watergate conspiracy unraveled in the spring of 1973, his physical and psychological health systematically decayed. The man who had carefully curated an image of iron-willed statesmanship was visibly unraveling. Aides reported that his face was frequently covered in a sheen of sweat. He lost weight. His suits hung loosely on his frame. He suffered from severe bouts of phlebitis, a painful inflammation of the veins in his legs, exacerbated by his constant agitated pacing across the carpets of the executive mansion. He stopped sleeping. He would stay awake until 3 or 4 in the morning, making slurred, angry phone calls to his subordinates, obsessing over media coverage and plotting ways to destroy the investigators closing in on him. And this is where the relationship with the Scotch bottle fundamentally shifted. Up to this point, alcohol was a coping mechanism, a way to wind down after a brutal day of political combat. But as the Senate Watergate Committee began broadcasting their hearings on national television in the summer of 1973, exposing the inner workings of his administration to the world, the drinking changed. It was no longer a tool for relaxation. It became an absolute physical and emotional requirement. The Scotch became the only barrier between his conscious mind and the terrifying reality that his legacy was evaporating. He was trapped in the White House, watching his closest aides, the men who had built a wall around him, being indicted and sent to prison. He was entirely isolated. He retreated frequently to Camp David or his estate in San Clemente, California, hiding from the press and the public. He would sit in complete silence for hours, staring out at the ocean, a man entirely consumed by his own impending ruin. The paranoia reached fever pitches. He ordered the removal of Secret Service agents, whom he suspected of spying on him for the FBI. He began to distrust the very military aides who carried the nuclear football. The system of government was functioning, but the brain at the center of the executive branch was heavily sedated and paralyzed by fear. He fired the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, in a brutal purge known as the Saturday Night Massacre, an act of sheer desperation that only accelerated his downfall and triggered the first serious calls for his impeachment. The public saw a tyrant desperately clinging to power. The inner circle saw a terrified man incapable of processing reality. He was legally cornered, politically bankrupt, and psychologically exhausted. Every attempt to block the investigation only provided more evidence of obstruction. The lie he constructed in June 1972 had mutated into a monster that was consuming his presidency minute by minute. He had convinced himself that he had to break the law to protect the office, completely blind to the fact that his actions were dismantling the very institution he claimed to revere. By the autumn of 1973, the domestic fortress was completely breached. His approval ratings plummeted, his allies in Congress were abandoning him, and the threat of criminal prosecution loomed over the Oval Office. But the true danger was not domestic. The true danger was that the commander-in-chief was chemically and psychologically incapacitated exactly when the world outside his window suddenly caught fire. And this is where things really get dirty. October 1973. The American political structure is experiencing a seismic event, but the true catastrophe is unfolding thousands of miles away. On the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria launches a massive coordinated surprise attack against Israel. The Yom Kippur War detonates with terrifying speed. Within days, Israeli defenses are buckling. The Soviet Union immediately begins resupplying the Arab coalition, aggressively positioning itself to dominate the Middle East. The world is suddenly looking at the very real prospect of a proxy war escalating into a direct nuclear confrontation between the two superpowers. This is the ultimate test of the commander-in-chief. This is the exact geopolitical nightmare the entire American security apparatus is designed to manage. As Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev sends a highly aggressive hotline message to Washington, threatening unilateral Soviet military intervention, if the Israelis do not stop their counteroffensive, the White House plunges into absolute panic. The Situation Room demands an immediate, forceful presidential response. A decision must be made regarding the deployment of American forces and the escalation of nuclear readiness to deter Moscow. But the desk in the Oval Office is empty. The President of the United States has retreated to his private living quarters. The crushing weight of the Watergate scandal, the relentless subpoenas, the daily drumbeat of impending impeachment, the recent humiliating resignation of his own vice president, Spiro Agnew, over a separate corruption scandal, has finally shattered his psychological endurance. He physically isolates himself from his own government. The coping mechanism has morphed into a debilitating dependency. Declassified transcripts of telephone conversations from the National Security Council reveal a horrifying reality. British Prime Minister Edward Heath places an urgent, secure call to the White House, desperately needing to coordinate a unified Western response to the escalating oil crisis and the Soviet threat. He expects to speak to the leader of the free world. Instead, the call is intercepted by Henry Kissinger. In a hushed, frantic exchange with an aide, Kissinger issues a directive that stands as one of the most chilling indictments of executive failure in modern history. He tells his staff that they cannot put the prime minister through to the president. The reason is explicitly stated in the historical record. The commander-in-chief is too intoxicated to pick up the receiver. The physical manifestation of his psychological collapse was now undeniable. The man who had built his entire career projecting the image of a ruthless, calculating cold warrior, the architect of the madman theory who bragged about his willingness to use nuclear weapons, was lying incapacitated in the executive residence, while actual Soviet nuclear material was reportedly moving toward the Mediterranean. The gap between the terrifying public persona he cultivated and the pathetic private reality he inhabited is absolute. With the president heavily sedated and unreachable, a silent, unconstitutional transfer of power occurs. In the middle of the night, Henry Kissinger, Chief of Staff Alexander Haig, and Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger convene an emergency meeting without the elected leader of the country. They make the unilateral decision to raise the alert level of the United States military to DEFCON 3, the highest peacetime state of readiness. They put global nuclear forces on standby. They issue orders to the Strategic Air Command and deploy aircraft carriers, all while the man legally required to authorize these apocalyptic maneuvers is sleeping off a haze of scotch and pharmaceuticals just a few rooms away. The system of checks and balances completely fails because the human being at the center of the system has fundamentally broken down, and that very habit, the reliance on isolation and chemical escape, will come back to ruin him completely as the calendar turns to 1974. The Middle Eastern crisis eventually de-escalates, but the internal crisis inside the White House becomes terminal. The Watergate special prosecutor is closing in on the secret audio tapes, demanding the very recordings that prove the president ordered the cover-up. The Supreme Court is preparing to rule against him. The House Judiciary Committee is publicly debating articles of impeachment. He is trapped. The physical decay accelerates with horrifying visibility. Aides and cabinet members observe a man hollowed out by fear. The tailored suits now hang off a drastically diminished frame. His face is pale, his eyes dart constantly, and his hands tremble during meetings. The psychological weakness that defined his entire life, the terror of humiliation, the absolute dread of being utterly defeated by his political enemies, is no longer a theoretical fear. It is a daily, suffocating reality. He begins to exhibit behaviors that cross the line from intense stress into profound clinical depression and paranoia. Reports from the Secret Service detail a ghostly routine. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, the heavy doors of the Lincoln bedroom frequently open. The president emerges, completely alone, wearing rumpled clothes or a bathrobe. He wanders the silent, dimly lit corridors of the second floor. The security details watch from the shadows as he paces back and forth, dragging his feet across the thick carpets. The vivid visual is almost gothic in its tragedy. The most powerful man on the planet, stripped of his authority, arguing with the air. He stops in front of the oil portraits of his predecessors. He stands before the painting of Theodore Roosevelt, a man of robust action, and murmurs incoherently. He moves to the portrait of Abraham Lincoln, a leader who endured the shattering of the nation, and asks the canvas how a president is supposed to survive when everyone has turned against him. He lingers agonizingly in front of the portrait of John F. Kennedy, the man whose effortless grace and inherited wealth had always fueled his deepest resentments. He stares at the image of his dead rival and demands to know the secret of his survival. He is prosecuting ghosts, searching for a legal defense in the faces of history. This is the peak of the grotesque. The machinery of government is grinding to a halt because its chief executive is haunting his own residence. He is no longer reading intelligence briefings. He is reading historical biographies, obsessively searching for precedents of presidents who survived total ruin. He stops holding cabinet meetings. The Oval Office becomes a museum piece, largely abandoned by the man who fought so viciously to occupy it. He prefers the small, claustrophobic space of the Lincoln sitting room, a tiny alcove where he can control the environment, surrounded by the glow of a fire, even in the dead of summer, with a glass of scotch permanently resting on the side table. The psychological dam finally breaks on the night of August 7th, 1974. The political reality is no longer deniable. Senior Republican senators, including the fiercely conservative Barry Goldwater, have marched into the White House earlier that afternoon to deliver the final verdict. They informed him directly that his support in the Senate has completely collapsed. He will be impeached and he will be convicted. The fortress has fallen. There is no legal maneuver left. There is no political trick that can reverse the momentum. The humiliation he feared his entire life is absolute and inescapable. Late that evening, he summons Henry Kissinger to the Lincoln sitting room. The Secretary of State arrives to find a scene of total human devastation. The president is heavily intoxicated, his speech slurred, his eyes red and swollen. The fierce, combative politician who had debated Khrushchev and bombed Hanoi is gone. What remains is the frightened, inadequate boy from Yorba Linda, terrified of being exposed as a fraud. He begins to weep openly. He forces Kissinger, a brilliant, cynical geopolitical strategist who escaped the horrors of Nazi Germany, to endure an agonizing display of emotional collapse. He demands that they pray. The President of the United States drops heavily to his knees on the carpet. He pulls Kissinger down with him. He begins to pray out loud, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. He begs for forgiveness, not for the crimes he committed against the Constitution, but for the failure of his presidency. He leans forward, burying his face in his hands, striking his fists against the floorboards. He looks up at his Secretary of State, desperate for validation, and asks the central question that has haunted his entire existence. Henry, am I a bad man? Was I a bad president? Kissinger attempts to offer words of historical comfort, reminding him of the opening to China and the arms control treaties with the Soviet Union. But the diplomatic flattery is useless against the crushing weight of reality. As the session finally ends and Kissinger turns to leave the room, the president issues a frantic, desperate plea. He begs Kissinger never to tell anyone what he just witnessed. He demands absolute secrecy regarding this moment of total weakness. His final concern is not the state of the Union, but the preservation of a tough, unyielding public image that had already been entirely destroyed. He wants to maintain the fiction of strength, even as he collapses on the rug. But the plot twist is in the Pentagon. The horrifying reality of a deeply unstable, heavily intoxicated president grappling with total ruin has not gone unnoticed by the men who control the physical machinery of American power. While the president weeps on the carpet, a silent, unprecedented operation is already underway across the Potomac River. The military establishment has recognized that the madman theory is no longer a diplomatic strategy. It is a medical diagnosis. and the man holding the launch codes is rapidly losing his grip on reality. The profound danger of the situation was no longer confined to the Oval Office or the emotional wreckage on the carpet of the Lincoln sitting room. The crisis had crossed the Potomac River and entered the highly secured corridors of the Pentagon. The Department of Defense operates on a strict, unyielding chain of command, designed specifically to execute the orders of the civilian leadership without hesitation. The entire architecture of the American nuclear deterrent rests on a singular, terrifying premise. The President of the United States and the President alone possesses the absolute authority to order a nuclear strike. There is a two-man rule in the underground missile silos and aboard the submarines to prevent a rogue operator from starting a war. But at the very apex of the command structure, there is no check, no balance, and no required second opinion. The system assumes that the individual holding the office is rational. By August 1974, the men running the military had accumulated enough evidence to conclude that this assumption was entirely invalid. The prosecution points directly to a chilling encounter that forced the military establishment to act. During a gathering with a group of congressional lawmakers, a meeting intended to project executive stability amidst the swirling impeachment crisis, the president attempted to demonstrate his unyielding grasp on global affairs. Instead, his deep psychological deterioration bled through the facade. He looked at the politicians, his eyes betraying a volatile mixture of exhaustion and defiance, and casually dropped a horrifying statistic into the conversation. He stated clearly that he could simply leave the room, pick up a telephone, and in 25 minutes, 70 million people would be dead. He intended this statement to be a display of ultimate authority, a reminder of his raw power to men who were actively trying to remove him from office. He wanted to project the image of a formidable commander who still controlled the fate of the earth. But the reality of his everyday personality, the slurred speech, the visible trembling, the documented reliance on heavy sedatives and scotch, transformed the boast from a political tactic into a genuine security threat. The lawmakers were horrified. Word of this erratic comment immediately reached the highest levels of the national security apparatus. The madman theory, once a carefully calibrated diplomatic bluff designed to intimidate Soviet leadership, had internalized. The commander-in-chief was now using the threat of global annihilation to intimidate his own domestic political rivals. The physical manifestation of this danger landed on the desk of Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger. A severe, highly analytical man, Schlesinger found himself staring into a constitutional abyss. He was observing a president whose behavior had become entirely detached from strategic reality. The executive branch was paralyzed, the intelligence agencies were compromised by the Watergate cover-up, and the man with the nuclear launch codes was wandering the White House hallways in the middle of the night, arguing with portraits. Schlesinger realized that the system of government had a fatal vulnerability. It provided no legal mechanism to temporarily disarm a commander-in-chief who was experiencing an acute psychological breakdown. Schlesinger chose to execute a silent, unprecedented intervention. He summoned the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General George Brown. In a quiet, highly classified directive, the Secretary of Defense issued an order that fundamentally altered the chain of command. He instructed the military leadership that if any emergency orders, particularly those involving nuclear forces, came directly from the White House, The military was absolutely forbidden to execute them immediately. Any command from the president had to be routed directly to Schlesinger or Secretary of State Henry Kissinger for explicit cross-verification. This was the ultimate drama-filled contradiction. The men sworn to uphold the Constitution were actively subverting the legal authority of the president to protect the nation from the president himself. They had effectively instituted a soft coup in the shadows of the Pentagon. The highest link in the chain of command was quietly severed because the individual occupying the office was deemed psychologically incapable of managing the weapons of mass destruction. History rarely acknowledges the sheer terror of these few days, when the safety of the world relied not on democratic institutions, but on a few unelected officials who recognized that absolute power had finally broken the mind of the man wielding it. Inside the White House, the atmosphere had descended from political panic into a grim medical watch. The reality of his impending removal was absolute, and the focus of the senior staff shifted entirely to the immediate physical survival of the president. The medical unit was placed on high alert. Dr. Walter Teacock, the president's personal physician, quietly instructed the staff to monitor all medications. They systematically combed through the private quarters, confiscating excess sleeping pills, tranquilizers, and any pharmaceutical tools that could be used for self-harm. The executive mansion, the global epicenter of political power, had essentially been converted into a high-security psychiatric ward. The deepest glimpse into his psychological state came during a private, agonizing conversation with his chief of staff, Alexander Haig. Haig was a 4-star military general, a man accustomed to order and discipline, now tasked with managing the final collapse of a civilian leader. The president looked at his chief of staff, the facade of the tough, calculating politician completely stripped away. He spoke with a quiet, hollow desperation, framing his ruin in military terms. He remarked to Haig that military men had a specific way of handling unendurable disgrace. He noted that in the Army, when an officer faced absolute ruin, someone would quietly leave a loaded pistol in his desk drawer, allowing him to take the honorable way out. He then looked directly at Haig and stated simply that he did not have a pistol. This was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a terrifying probe, a man crushed by the weight of his own fatal weakness, the terror of public humiliation, actively contemplating the final escape. The gap between the man who ruthlessly orchestrated the bombing of Cambodia and the man asking his aid about a suicide weapon is the defining tragedy of his existence. Haig, chilled by the implication, immediately intensified the watch protocols. He ordered the staff to ensure the president was never left entirely alone. The corridors echoed with a surreal soundtrack to this decay. Late into the night, staff members could hear the swelling, dramatic orchestral music of Victory at Sea, a soaring documentary soundtrack about World War II naval battles, blasting at deafening volumes from the president's private rooms. He sat alone in the dark, drinking scotch, drowning out the reality of his criminal exposure with the triumphant music of a war he was not fighting. The public end arrived on August 8, 1974. He sat before the television cameras in the Oval Office to announce his resignation. Even in his final address, the psychological armor remained bolted in place. He offered no genuine confession. He framed his departure as a loss of a political mandate, a pragmatic decision made because he no longer had the congressional support necessary to govern. He refused to acknowledge the obstruction of justice, the abuse of power, or the profound corruption of the intelligence agencies. He could not permit himself the vulnerability of a true apology. To admit absolute fault would be to validate the lifelong fear that the establishment had finally beaten him. The true nature of his internal devastation was exposed the following morning, August 9th, in the East Room of the White House. Speaking to his cabinet and weeping staff members, the carefully constructed script fell apart. He delivered a rambling, emotionally raw farewell. The mask slipped entirely, revealing the deeply scarred boy from Yorba Linda. He spoke obsessively about his poverty, about reading books he did not own, and delivered a strange, tearful monologue about his parents. He declared his mother a saint, a jarringly intimate confession delivered in the grandest room of the executive mansion. It was the final manifestation of his hamartia. In his ultimate moment of defeat, his mind retreated to the deepest roots of his insecurity, the childhood trauma that had fueled his entire relentless, destructive climb to power. Then came the physical departure. He walked out onto the south lawn toward the waiting helicopter, Marine One. He reached the top of the stairs, turned to face the cameras, and executed the most jarring visual contradiction of the 20th century. He thrust both arms into the air, his fingers forming the rigid V for victory signs, and stretched his face into a massive, forced smile. It was a grotesque performance. He was a man utterly broken, facing criminal indictment and historical disgrace, physically pantomiming the posture of a conquering hero. He boarded the aircraft, and the door closed on his presidency. A month later, his successor, Gerald Ford, granted him a full, absolute pardon for any crimes committed against the United States. The public reaction was explosive, condemning the pardon as a corrupt bargain that placed the former president above the law. Yet, archival evidence and accounts from Ford's inner circle suggest a far darker, preventative calculus. Ford was briefed on the catastrophic state of his predecessor's mental health in exile in California. He was suffering from severe physical ailments and profound debilitating depression. The prosecution was gathering, and the prospect of dragging a mentally shattered former commander-in-chief through a brutal years-long criminal trial posed a severe risk. Many historians assess that the pardon was driven in significant part by the terrifying fear that a criminal indictment would be the final trigger, pushing the isolated man in San Clemente to take his own life. The pardon was not a legal exoneration. It was a desperate political tourniquet applied to save the republic from the trauma of a presidential suicide. Banished to his California estate and stripped of power, the physical decay accelerated. Barely a month after his resignation, a severe bout of phlebitis brought him to the edge of death. Yet, the psychological armor remained intact. Facing financial ruin, he monetized his own disgrace through the Frost/Nixon interviews in 1977. He disastrously claimed on global television that when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. It was the ultimate, unvarnished articulation of the disease that had infected his presidency. Realizing domestic apologies would never clear his name, he bypassed the American political arena entirely. He executed a shadow presidency, traveling to Beijing and Moscow, positioning himself as the indispensable oracle of the Cold War. Slowly, he forced the very establishment that had ousted him to quietly seek his counsel on grand strategy. Richard Nixon's life was defined by a brilliant intellect, bound to a catastrophic psychological fragility. He proved that the sheer weight of the Oval Office can accelerate the unraveling of the human mind. The tragedy of his administration remains a clinical demonstration of what happens when massive geopolitical power is wielded by a profoundly wounded ego. When he died in April 1994, the state funeral in Yorba Linda was a televised spectacle attended by 4 living presidents. He had perfectly engineered an impossible paradox. The man whose paranoia nearly collapsed the architecture of global security ensured history would never simply remember him as a monster, but as the ghost Washington could never quite exorcise.